Okay. All right. Well, welcome once again, everyone. Thanks for your patience as we launch our online presence for the province and our Justice and Peace Ministry, and hopefully many other opportunities will arise for us to be able to share together as a community, all of us rooted in the spirit of Augustine. So thank you again for coming to this first webinar, and hopefully the technology will continue to work for us. I also want to thank the Office for Justice and Peace, our Justice and Peace Commission, as well as our ADROP office for really organizing this whole venue. A couple of things just to remind you about. On Friday, March 20th, our prior general, Father Alejandro Morel Antón, has invited the whole Augustinian family to a day of prayer and to unite in our common prayer together. So you'll be able to download the prayer resources found on the Augustine.org website. It's also been advertised through our various forms of social media. So please be sure to do that as we pray together to end the coronavirus. Just a couple of things in terms of our time tonight, a few things to note. The session's being recorded and it will be available later thanks to Lacey Michelson in the ADROP office. And I've already muted everybody, but the online chat is available, and that will be particularly helpful when I finish my reflections. And also, I'm just hoping to give like 20-ish minutes, which will probably turn into a half hour, just knowing how we end up. We anticipate a certain amount of time, and then, of course, things just kind of take a little bit longer than normal. And also, I just want to preface this that in a real spirit of hopefully Augustinian humility, I can't claim to know everything about Augustine nor about Catholic social teaching, let alone how the two may be dialoguing. So I'm just hoping that it's going to be a reflection from how I see things through the lens of spirituality, particularly Augustinian spirituality. So hopefully that will be a helpful starting point for our series that's going to take us through the fall. Okay. So in order for us to begin properly, I thought it would be helpful if we pray together the words from Augustine. It's found in the Confessions, the first paragraph there. So feel free if you want to say it aloud or to yourself, but we'll begin by just reminding ourselves that we are in the presence of a God who holds all of us closely, who holds the whole world, this God who offers a healing, loving presence. And so we pray, great are you, O Lord, and worthy of praise. How limitless is your power, how immeasurable your wisdom. You have so made us that we long for you, and our heart is restless until it rests in you. So tonight, as we start to lay the groundwork for St. Augustine of Hippo and his dialogue with what we now call Catholic social teaching, I'm hoping to offer a spiritual reflection. But just a couple things of note to preface the conversation. First, I always think it's important to keep St. Augustine in context. A 5th century North African and Roman. That much of what he has to say, it's hard to kind of just take a quote from him. I know that we all are eager to find nice, pithy quotes, but oftentimes when we do that, we lose his overall context and actually what drove him to make a certain point that we might be quoting. So we could actually misquote him by not having the proper context. So in other words, Augustine we can't look at in a vacuum. We have to understand somewhat his world, his issues, and what he was dialoguing with during his day. This isn't to say that he's not timely, nor that what he has to say isn't timeless, because I believe, and I think all of us gathered here tonight virtually, believe that Augustine is for our times, very much so, a voice that we need for the 21st century. but we just have to be careful how we use him. That's why I always like to say, instead of saying, what would Augustine say about this, or how might Augustine offer this, I'd like to see him more as somebody that companions us, that accompanies us in the journey. Second, I realize that we too are not in a vacuum. Little did we know that when we quite randomly chose this date back in December, maybe the beginning of January, to launch this webinar series and to go live for the first time as a province, that we would be in the midst of a global crisis and pandemic. And really, at least in the US, just at the beginning stages, not really even trying to be able to get our minds and hearts around what this is actually going to mean for us as a country, and also for the world as the impact unfolds. That the series then is on Augustine Catholic social teaching, I would say is of the Spirit. Because I don't know about you, but when I look at the word Catholic social teaching up there on the screen, there's a great emphasis on the word social. It's, for me, bolded, italicized, underscored, particularly in light of three things, which make me ask a few questions, and maybe perhaps I look like this emoji. Maybe you are as well. These are the three questions that are going to be the background for our reflection tonight. The first one would be, what might the practice of social distancing reveal about Catholic social teaching itself? And does Augustine's accompaniment offer us anything? So this whole thing of social distancing, a phrase that I only started using last week and I didn't even know what it meant. But how can that be seen through the lens of Catholic social teaching, and particularly what Augustine may offer? Can social distancing and self-isolation deepen our understanding of Augustine's call to community and our need for community? Is there something about distancing ourselves that might give us a better overview, a better vision of what it is that we're actually about as Christians? And thirdly, are these practices of self-isolation, social distancing, calling our attention to those who, for whatever reason, have already been isolated and distanced in our world? Those who are most vulnerable, those who are the least among us. So again, to help us see through the lens of the gospel, what Jesus was always inviting us and challenging us to do, to look for the least, to look for the marginalized. And can this practice of social distancing and self-isolation help us get in touch with that reality all the more? So those are our three questions, our background questions. And I'd be curious when we open up the chat for further reflection at the end of my input, how you might see these questions, or perhaps even are there other questions that surface for you as well? So let's get started. One of the questions I always like to ask my students, and no matter what class I'm teaching, I always tend to bring Augustine in. He's my default and go-to person. I often will refer to him as good old Gus or Augie, and the students just kind of look at me, perhaps how you're looking at me right now as well. As much as Augustine was introspective and self-reflective, he was also highly relational. We all know this, and perhaps that's why he is so attractive to us. We see this particularly in the way he accounts the importance of friendship and its varying degrees in the Confessions, for instance. So much so that before his famous/infamous conversion scene in the garden found in Book 8 of the Confessions, he spoke about how he and his friends wanted to experience leisure together, or in other words, talk about the deep stuff of life, to be really true philosophers in a real sense of being lovers of wisdom and just sharing the important matters of reality. It seems, though, that even this desire for relationality and friendship were converted and transformed along with him at his baptism, as well as when his friends were also plunged into the waters of baptism. So I would like to say that all of those initial desires that Augustine had at the beginning of his life up until the moment of baptism, God used and transformed for the greater good of the world, for what Augustine contributed to theology, to spirituality, to philosophy, etc. So this whole thing of what made Augustine tick then, I would like to say that it's this scene from the Acts of the Apostles that's up there on the PowerPoint. It's from Acts chapter 4, verses 32 to 35. We hear it during Easter time, and it's basically a description of the first community, that after the death and resurrection of Jesus, and probably after the moment of Pentecost when the Spirit was breathed onto those who were in the upper room and they went out on mission, there was something that happened to them. And we find this description, that the original Jerusalem community, the original Christian community, that became really Augustine's invitation for understanding his own way of life, for understanding how he was going to live his relationship with Christ and with his friends. And so we read, the community of believers was of one heart and mind, and no one claimed that any of his possessions was his own, but they had everything in common. With great power, the apostles bore witness to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great favor was accorded them all. There was no needy person among them, for those who owned property or houses would sell them, bring the proceeds of the sale, and put them at the feet of the apostles, and they were distributed to each according to need. You'll see that I highlighted or bolded some key phrases, at least the way I read this text. The first is one heart and mind. The second is in common. The third is witness to the resurrection, that Augustine came to believe that when people were of one mind and heart together and held things in common, they were giving a key witness to the resurrection and the presence of the risen Christ among them and in the world. And how this was seen often was that there was no needy person among them, that everything was distributed to all members, each according to need. Certainly, it's an ideal for Christianity. It's an ideal of gospel living, and it's an ideal that Augustine really held up and tried to make real in his life. And so I would like to say that this is going to be our guiding text for understanding how Augustine might dialogue today, how he would accompany us in trying to unpack the wisdom of Catholic social teaching. I think it's really rooted in this, and really what came to be known as his rule, or the way of life that the friars and the sisters live. But first, I want to see about capturing this whole notion of one mind and heart. We tend to say, oh, wow, this is such a great phrase, to be one in mind and heart together, to really experience unity. But Augustine, scholars have revealed, was not always there with this phrase. It was always a phrase that jumps out at him. He was very much intrigued by being one in mind and heart. But what scholars have revealed is that he actually developed his thinking. And I think this development, we'll just briefly look at it, may help us understand our own context today. And the first would be that he first looked at this one mind and heart, this union of mind and heart, within the individual person, himself or herself. That was first which was very attractive to him. And we see this in some of his key writings, notably his exposition on Psalm 4, where he talks about a unity that the individual person experiences because they are made from God. That the unity of God is breathed, formed into the individual person. So we're talking about a person that's working toward integration and really tapping into all that God wants for that person, to be an undivided person, to be what Augustine says, to be single-minded and single-hearted, where nothing is divided or disintegrated in the person. What scholars have revealed, which is, I think, is pretty kind of interesting, is that Augustine eventually moved to this collective sense where he started understanding it in a communal sense with a bunch of people rooted in their baptism, he was able to do that with the help of other people around him. And so this is where we can start to see Augustine in his context and how he was thinking through things and impacted by the way other people were thinking through things as well. And so one scholar in particular, Luc Verheyen, one of our Dutch friars, who did a lot of work on really unpacking the rule of Augustine in the 60s and the 70s. He has since died. But he was able to locate this development through a series of Augustine's letters. One such letter comes from Paulinus of Nola and his wife Theresia. Paulinus and Theresia lived basically, I would say, in a suburb of Naples. So all those people out there that have Neapolitan blood in them, maybe you're somehow related to Paulinus and Theresia. And it seems that in this one particular letter, actually Paulinus and Theresia wrote Augustine twice, but Augustine may not have gotten the first letter, or he at least did not respond to it. But he seems to respond to the second one. It was given to him in the year 394. It's letter 30, where Paulinus and Theresia greet Augustine and say to him, "We are one in mind and heart with you." So just think about the power of that phrase, just for a moment. For someone to say to them, to you, that I am one in mind and heart. That was how they greeted Augustine in his in the letter that they wrote to him, actually in two letters. And then Augustine responds, I think it's a letter 31, where he basically acknowledges that insight and thanks them for that insight. Now, his response is written around, scholars say, around the year 396 and 397. Interestingly, those were the years that Augustine also composed the Confessions as well as his Rule of Life. So it seems what I'm suggesting is that Augustine got to his rule and a particular understanding of how to live together as a Christian community because of the impact of other people who invited him to be one in mind and heart with them. So we thank Paulinus and Theresia for their communication. So I just pose a question. Which is harder, to be single-minded and single-hearted within your person, to be completely integrated and work toward wholeness, or also to have that integration in a collective sense, in a communal sense? I think in some ways both are hard. And in some ways I kind of resist both. This whole notion of oneness of mind and heart. But then we also see another insight from Augustine. Again, it's written around the same year, where Augustine opens up his Confessions and says, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." That was the prayer that we opened up our time together tonight. Now, notice something. It's often mistranslated. Most people are familiar with this quote, but end up saying, "Our hearts are restless until they rest in you." But Augustine was actually very clear in the Latin, where it says, it literally translates, "Our heart is restless until it rests in you." So he sees humanity as sharing in one heart. Might this have been given to him by the insights of Paulinus and Theresia, right? And again, these lines are written around the same time that he also composed his Rule of Life. So you see a shift in Augustine's thinking, this more corporate and collective sense of being one. So what does oneness look like? So I bring this up for two reasons. First, as I've already said, to show the development in Augustine. So again, we can't just look at him as in a vacuum, but also as someone that developed and grew in his thinking, which is very human, right? Because all of us are really invited on the journey to grow, to develop, change our thinking, right? Edit ourselves from time to time, get corrected, and go deeper in our understanding of ourselves, one another, and God. But also, this movement from the individual sense of oneness to the collective sense of oneness. In our context in the 21st century, how might we benefit from this development in Augustine's thought? How are we being called to be one in mind and heart together in this online presence, in this virtual presence? Can we say that we are one together, right? How are we experiencing oneness of mind and heart during this global pandemic? Even when we practice social distancing, can we feel the bonds and strength of community even more? I think these questions can help us understand Augustine and how he is companioning us in Catholic social teaching, to be one in mind and heart with our neighbor, whom we are socially distant from, and whom we might not even know or ever know. So not just the people that we're distant from right now, those that are close to us, but those people across the world, particularly, again, those who are suffering in certain ways, those who have been suffering long before the coronavirus. How are we being called to be one in mind and heart with them? In other words, can we really understand it as really being in this together? Catholic social teaching underscores this reality and challenges us to really be in this meaning our reality, our world, together. So some of you perhaps might not know all of the principles, but there's actually 7 principles that are associated with Catholic social teaching. And I'm going to try to show how some of them are present in Augustine's spirituality. So here are the 7 principles. Oh, let me bring that back. Here we go. Sorry about that. So we see the dignity of the human person, call to community participation, protection of human rights, option for the poor and most vulnerable, dignity and rights of workers, solidarity, care for creation. You'll notice 5 of the 7 are bolded or highlighted. I would suggest that these 5 are probably more obvious in the rule than the other 2, but I think that the other 2 are also there, okay? Let's see, make sure I'm on the right. Okay. And also, when we look at the rule of Augustine, there are a lot of values that are kind of laden throughout it. And here are some that I would say are present, that I think all speak of Catholic social teaching in one form or another. The first, and probably the one that's kind of glossed over very, very quickly, is the primacy of love, which we'll get to in just a second. The mutual sharing of goods, unity, but that is not understood as uniformity. Humility, which I'd like to say is being truly grounded in our humanity, in the earth, in the fact that we are created by God. Empathy, communal and individual responsibility, understanding of personhood, care of the wounded or woundedness in the self, other, and also communal wounds or corporate wounds. Transparency of relationships. And the last one is practice, that it takes practice to live out these values, to live out Catholic social teaching. Primacy of love. I think this is the foundational value that's located in the rule of Augustine. And it comes across, well, first, what I want to say, we'll go to this. In chapter 1 of the rule, these are the things that come out of Acts 4:32. You can read them, but I'll read them aloud, and then we'll get into the primacy of love. Before all else, love God and then your neighbor, because these are the chief commandments given to us. The main purpose for your having come together is to live harmoniously in your house, one in mind and heart on the way to God. Call nothing your own, but let everything be yours in common. Let all of you then live together in oneness of mind and heart, mutually honoring God in yourselves, whose temples you have become. Now, that's the gist of chapter 1. It's not a terribly long chapter, but it's the foundational piece to understanding the rule. And it's really through this primacy of love, or Augustine's favorite, he loved to talk about what he called the double commandment of love, the love of God and the love of neighbor, which for Augustine is the same thing. In his 7th homily on the first letter of John, it's very striking what he says. In the first letter of John, we get that infamous phrase, or famous phrase, that God is love. Well, what Augustine does in the 7th homily is he flips it and says, to understand that God is love, love is God. So that when we love properly, we are experiencing God in a profound, deep way. That when we are loving as Christ loves, God is loving in us and through us. And it's seen in how we love the other, our neighbor, those whom we know and those whom we don't know, those who are socially distant to us and from us in every aspect imaginable. When we love them, God is loving in us and through us, and we are receiving God's love as well when we receive their love. These are the chief commandments, Augustine tells us. And how is it seen? By striving to live harmoniously, that oneness of mind and heart. And he adds, on the way to God, which I always say that it gives us a little bit of room for error. When you put people together, we say, in the Gospel of Matthew, where 2 or 3 are gathered together, there Jesus is in their midst. But I also like to say, where 2 or 3 people are gathered together, even for the sake of God, there also conflict arises. And so this whole room of on the way to God, in fits and starts, that it takes some time to get there, that we might not get there on this side of the kingdom. In particular, though, for Augustine, it's about how we look at ownership and possession. If we can move from that individual understanding and move to a communal understanding, Augustine seems to think that that's the way forward, that's the way to God, to really experience that collective sense, that collective ownership of really being in this together, and what he would say, mutually share our goods with each other. And then he says, of course, by doing that, we are mutually honoring God in one another, whose temples we have become. So just something a little fun to show the reality of possession in our lives, and what I also like to say, possessiveness in our lives. I found this online a couple years ago, and I've used it in various presentations, and it might strike you as a little hitting too close to home, but they're called a toddler's rules of possession. The first one, if I like it, it's mine. If it's in my hand, it's mine. If I can take it from you, it's mine. If I had it a little while ago, it's mine. If it's mine, it must never appear to be yours in any way. If I'm doing or building something, all the pieces are mine. If it looks just like mine, it's mine. If I saw it first, it's mine. If you're playing with something and you put it down, it automatically becomes mine. And if it's broken, it's yours. Right? So maybe you're chuckling a little bit, or maybe there's crickets going on out there. I can't tell because I have you all muted, and maybe it's better for my own sake. But as much as it's funny, a toddler's rules of possession, how often do these become how we possess, right? Not even just our material goods, but the stuff that we hold near and dear. How often does this get in the way or drive how we interact with each other? And might Augustine and Catholic social teaching provide an antidote and really challenge that? So I'm going to suggest that Augustine comes up with a mature Christian adult's rules of possession. And this is what they look like. Moving from possession to non-possession. from possessive love to non-possessive love. And that's really at the heart of the gospel, in loving like Jesus, to love non-possessively without condition. And from ownership to mutual sharing of goods. That when we really are loving non-possessively, when we share all things in common, we're not putting conditions or parameters around that which we share and which we are being asked to share. We can see then what ends up being developed by Augustine in his rule, which I think also can be seen in Catholic social teaching, is really the respect for the individual within the midst of a community. So it's not that the individual goes away in the community. Sometimes it's misunderstood, this oneness of mind and heart, that it doesn't matter who the people are that make up the community. For Augustine, it matters an awful lot. And so he talks about, he takes from the Acts of the Apostles, each according to need, that he invites his community and really all members of Christ, the church, to enter into a deep discernment of needs versus wants that would then yield to a discernment of the common good through what he calls mutual sharing of goods, and how we end up practicing a just distribution of goods in the end. So I think a good example is happening right now in our country in terms of what's happening in the stores, right? The rush for, there's been all sorts of jokes now, the rush for toilet paper, right? How people just need that toilet paper and they're going to bump into whoever, they don't want anybody to stop them, right? Is there a real need, or is it simply a want, right? So again, that's just a kind of a lame example, but it really is asking us to examine what is it that we really, really need. And oftentimes the things that we think we need are really just wants and desires, right? But Augustine is asking the individual and the community to really discern together what is really needed. What are the basic needs to get through the pandemic, but to get through life and to experience life? And then how can we share them and respect them? Another piece, this movement toward the common good. So we're still respecting the individual person, but moving and inviting the individual person to look and see what is it that the community needs and wants. And so he says this. This is in chapter 5. In this way, no one shall perform any task for his or her own benefit, but all your work shall be done for the common good, with greater zeal and more dispatch than if each one of you were to work for yourself alone. For charity, caritas, as it is written, is not self-seeking, meaning that it places the common good before its own, not its own before the common good. And then he says, so whenever you show greater concern for the common good than for your own, you may know that you're growing in true love. That's what charity is really about. It's charity is really God's love, right? Is the way that God loves, and we're invited to participate in that. It's that loving non-possessively. And then the last piece that I would just invite us to reflect on is this whole notion of practice. We say practice makes perfect. Again, Augustine at the very end of the rule, chapter 8, he says, the Lord grant that you may observe all these precepts in a spirit of charity, and again, in a spirit of God's love, as lovers of spiritual beauty, giving forth the good odor of Christ in the holiness of your lives, not as slaves living under the law, but as those living in freedom under grace. And he does tell us at the end that we're not always going to get it right. And more often than not, we won't get it right. And so he invites us into this spirit of practice. So perhaps you're looking like this right now. I'm seeing some faces up there that look a little bit like this emoji. I'm just curious now, what are some thoughts, ponderings, and in fact, further reflections that this discussion may have stirred in you? Again, this wasn't to kind of give you all of how Augustine can companion us, but more just like a brief overview and perhaps even an entry point to help guide our discussions as the series progresses through the fall. So just take a moment, think about what was happening inside of you as I was rambling on, perhaps reading some slides, and perhaps it stirred something in your heart in terms of your own context, in terms of what we're going through as a nation, as a world, and how might this touch upon Augustine's insights and offerings. So just take a moment and then feel free to write some questions or even add some comments. It's 8:15 or almost 8:15 now, so maybe we'll go for 20 more minutes, but I want to be respectful of people's time. What's that? Oh yeah, you could also unmute yourself and ask the question, and then I could respond that way as well. That might even be easier.
Kevin?
Yes.
Joe Keffer here.
Hey, Joe.
Just automatically popped into my head. How do you apply these principles in the common era? And how do you distinguish the conflicts between the tradition of communism as we know it, as opposed to capitalism? We all would like to apply these principles to ensure that there is no one who is lacking.
Sure.
And yet to apply them is a big step from the principles you've discussed.
Oh yeah, no, it's the application. It takes practice, right? And certainly for those who try to live the rule, I'm thinking of the friars, the sisters, the lay Augustinians among us. We know that this is really hard to do on this side of the kingdom. I always like to say that, but I'd like to think that it is applicable. It's applicable, and I think it's more. I think the invitation and the challenge, first and foremost, ends up becoming more of a spiritual one, right? That I think that's where the transformation happens and can happen. So I'm not trying to dodge your question, but I'm thinking about, for instance, when you look at Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si, where what he ends up calling it really is the care for creation for our common home, right? How we look at the ecological crisis, for instance, climate change, et cetera. That his invitation is for us to look at it as a spiritual crisis, right? So I think oftentimes we don't want to go there, right? And so I think that's really where the challenge is, that if we can really allow our hearts to be moved by the gospel, because ultimately all of this is gospel based, right? And it's at the heart of gospel life. So what would that look like within a capitalist system, right? How do we end up treating the people that we work with in a respectful manner, right? It's that sort of stuff. So does that make sense?
Yes, but you've got a long way to go.
Sure.
Reading from the Acts of the Apostles, from each to everyone according to their need. Well, that's straight out of communist doctrine, but it hasn't been practical in the world to make it happen. Right. We can understand this within the community of the Augustinians, for example, in a monastery.
Yep.
That makes all the sense in the world following Augustine's rule. But in practice, trying to take that out into the world has been very difficult.
Yeah, that's right. It is difficult, and again, I'm not trying to dodge the question, because it's a difficult one for sure. But I think if it becomes the way out of which you or we try to operate, right, to help transform as much as we can, that we possibly can, with the help of God, with God's grace, to challenge unjust structures. Again, it's not going to happen on this side, but we can keep trying to work toward it. You know what I mean? I'm not going to be able to answer all the ramifications of everything that you're asking, but it's a good one to ponder.
Perhaps we'll hear more in answer to this in future webinars.
Yeah, I think so. That's right. Yeah. Thank you, though. Any other thoughts or insights or reflections?
Kevin?
Yes, Father Kevin.
Yes.
Backing up a little bit on that, don't you think that in today's world, I mean, it may be hard to live it every day, but especially in this crisis with the pandemic, I myself am seeing one heart and with people in things on Facebook and just at the grocery stores, with people offering to shop for the elderly who shouldn't be in grocery stores, or those that are ill, or maybe when the grocery store offers 2 packages of toilet paper, they turn around and hand one to the person behind them because there's no more on the shelf.
Yeah.
And I am seeing that.
Yeah.
Not everyone is practicing it, but I'd like to believe that for the most part, there is practice of it today.
That's right. I agree, and I think that even just how we approach this crisis, can we use it as an opportunity for further deepening of transformation, and how might God give us an opportunity to be transformed in this, right? And call us to deeper accountability in the gospel, et cetera. And I think, as you rightly say, it can happen, and it is happening for some. Oh, there's a
Kevin?
yes. Hold on for just 1 second. There's a question from the chat I want to be able to acknowledge. Someone added that during this time of self-sequestration, I'm taking care of grandchildren because my children are busy trying to make a living by teleworking. This is trying all of my patience. So tonight's discussion is all relevant. So I'm glad for that, right? Again, it's an opportunity for us to really get in touch with what might be the invitation from this, right? Again, it's Lent, and this is going to be a Lent never to be forgotten. But as we know, as people of faith, the resurrection happened, and that new life is waiting. So God will use this for sure. So thank you.
Kevin?
Yes, Paul.
I was really struck and helped by your description of that movement of Augustine from the individual understanding of one mind and heart in God to the communal, and by Paulinus and Theresia helping him along there. When you went through the rule and all, it was profound to see it there, but here's what comes to my mind.
Sure.
That communal meaning of one heart and mind in the rule seems more local, even inward, focused on community, than it does outward into, say, social justice concerns in our world. I sometimes would love to see, maybe it's in his other writings, like City of God and others, how we can help people move from the rules way of describing it, of, one sharing everything in common and everything so profoundly, and take that more specifically outward to, say, for instance, the next one of these webinars is going to be on criminal justice system.
Right.
How do we make that linkage? It doesn't seem too clear in the rule.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess, I mean, that's a really good point. I guess my initial thought to that, not that you even had like a question for me, but as we're dialoguing, I think it's the witness value that community, the way Augustine sees it, is not insular and for itself, right? It's to be able to go out. So if we all practice Christian community in our various forms as church, whether we're professed, valid members of religious community or not, but if we can practice the gospel as a local community in some form, whatever form that takes, it needs to be authentic. It has to have an outward thrust, right? So it then should take us out, right, into that. And again, that line from the Acts of the Apostles, it's in that expression that we're witnessing to the power of the resurrection, right? But it becomes a challenge then for us to bring it out, to try to live it together, but then to always kind of bring it out. So thanks for that, Paul.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Some other insights that people shared on written chat that I don't know that you can all see. Maybe you can see. I'm not sure. Oh, you can. Okay. So we can see the entire conversation was relevant and needed for our time. It's starting to move. Sorry, I'm not reading it. Let's see, is there anything else? Well, you can all read them. I just don't want to keep reading at you. You're all capable of reading. So I appreciate the insights that you're sharing. Any other points of reflection or insights?
Father Kevin?
Yeah.
Jonathan Jerome here. I was curious, the integration of heart and mind can be hard. You talk about it being challenging.
Right.
Before I can even imagine myself sort of working communally in this pursuit of one mind and heart.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on how we might find that integration in our own lives, especially in today's context. I can understand something. I can understand well, the reasons for a lot of the decisions around the coronavirus and the pandemic, but
Sure.
that doesn't mean that my heart has caught up to my head yet. And so I don't know if there are any thoughts on sort of what Augustine would say, or how that might translate into today's day and age.
Yeah, no, again, that's great. So I'm open for all people's contributions to this. I think what I might offer is that if we can see that development in Augustine's thinking from that individual sense of the personal integration toward the communal one, he didn't lose the individual sense still. So the singleness of mind and heart for the person was also important. And I think that one of his insights and contributions is that the two go hand in hand, right? So individual integration happens in how we live together as community, and vice versa, right? So it's this constant rubbing of shoulders, elbows, all this sort of stuff that I think it causes us sometimes to go inward, to do the interior work, to give the other person the benefit of the doubt, all that sort of stuff. And the more that we do that, I think it's an invitation to go deeper into God's desire for the person and also for the community. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, kind of addresses what you're saying, or maybe helps you think further. I'm not sure, but I think it kind of goes hand in hand. Because it's interesting, I may have said it very quickly, but we see Augustine as so relational, right? Something that's always kind of seen in the context of being in the company of other people. I mean, even his conversion scene, he has his best friend there with him, and his mother just like an earshot away as well. But yet he also contributes to this whole landscape of the inner life of the person in a way that nobody else really has done before him or even afterwards. So there's something about that he was very introspective, very self-reflective as well, and worked toward integration. But he needed other people to get him to do that as well, right?
Kevin?
Yes.
Forgive me for jumping in again, but I hope I'm not stealing one of Jeremy's great quotes for next week. But it's so profound and striking in terms of what you're saying. It's something like this. Augustine considers all of us beggars in relation to God.
Yeah.
And the primary way for all beggars to repay their debt to God is to help others who are less fortunate. So that notion that we're all beggars before God is a great leveling thing, isn't it? And we're not doing it out of some big pompous way. We're really great. We're all beggars. So I liked that a lot. So Jeremy's going to jump in with that next week. So
good. Well, it'll definitely be worth repeating, and it kind of goes along the side. This other thing that's come to me is this whole notion, and this is very, very striking, is he says in a couple of his letters, we belong to one another, right? And can, like, the context of our day help us to really see that we actually do belong to one another, right? There's a real humility to that we come from the same stuff, right? We the insight from Genesis that we come from the earth, and I think this is helping us even in the isolation that we're all experiencing from each other. And as much as, thank God for technology for this virtual stuff, but I think in our isolation we're realizing how much we do need each other in life, right? So we're beggars together, right?
Yeah, that was reflectful for me as well.
Oh, you just come over here, right?
I'm getting feedback. I'll go in the other room.
Okay, all right. He's been kind of watching over my shoulder the whole time because this is the first time I've ever done this. So.
Working off Father Kevin's comments, and then Renee had typed something here as well, that in this moments of solitude, I think we're realizing how much we need each other. But then I've been stepping back and thinking, why do I need these other people? Is it for me and my own good, or is it really we need each other in such profound ways that then I become more concerned for the common good? And I think that this time of being isolated I've been reflecting just on that. Is what am I missing and why? Why am I missing the other person? And I think Renee's typed comments really had thinking along the same lines.
Yeah, that's right. That's a great point. I'm thinking of like this whole notion of solitude, right? Can that really move us also to solitude towards solidarity? And can this experience of solitude that we're all experiencing, can it be also an expression of solidarity with one another? There's something deeply spiritual that we're being invited into here, and that's where transformation happens, and then that's going to help us in terms of our actions. So more to come, right? So I'm conscious it's 8:30. Just want to be respectful of people's times. This was our first go at it. So excuse me for having it done here in Burns Hall. Craig and I were hoping to have it in the VSB building on campus, where it was going to have all sorts of things that we would be able to do with it. But it just wasn't meant to be with the campus being shut down, and it is what it is. But I hope that it's been helpful. I think this is going to be a helpful tool for us to kind of just share with each other, and to experience community in a newer way, and also to move us to gratitude for the relationships that we have, right? That all of us in some way because of God, but also through Augustine, have found that we do belong to each other, right? And that he's helping us in our day today and companioning us so that we can actually accompany one another on the journey on the way to God. So thank you, everybody. This will, Lacey's going to be able to put this up so that it can be access for everyone. Hopefully it won't have to be edited out too much. I don't know what faces I was making. I probably will not watch it. I don't like to see myself, but anyway, so have a good night, and let's just keep being in this together with each other, praying for each other, and continuing to stay connected, most especially in our prayer. And don't forget to join us Friday as members of the Augustine family as we pray together in a special way. Take good care, everyone, and have a great night. God bless. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
God bless you too. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so now what do I do? Let's see. Where is this?
So I can stop share.
All right.
Stop video.
Oh,
I'll move over here.
move over here. Okay.
So you can just
End meeting.
for all.